In 1996, the Game Boy was the single best-selling video game console on the planet, outselling every home system Sony, Sega, and Nintendo's own competitors had on shelves. By the time production wound down in 2003, the line had moved well over 118 million units worldwide. Entire generations grew up defined by it. It was the console that survived spilled juice, concrete floors, and being run over by a bicycle, and somehow still powered on. The story everyone tells about why the Game Boy won is simple, and it is wrong. The story goes that Nintendo, fresh off the success of the NES, simply built a better machine than anyone else could. That the company that gave the world Mario and Zelda brought the same engineering magic to a portable format, and the competition never stood a chance. Here are the specifications of the machine that supposedly won on pure engineering superiority: a 4-shade, monochrome, non-backlit liquid crystal display, a processor clocked at roughly 4 MHz, which was already modest by 1989 standards, no color, no backlighting, which meant the screen was frequently unreadable without a strong external light source, a blur trail behind fast-moving sprites so pronounced that entire genres of game design had to root around it. Now consider what Nintendo's chief rival put on the market barely 6 months later. The Atari Lynx, launched in September of 1989, with a full-color backlit screen, hardware-accelerated sprite scaling and rotation that let it zoom and pan the display in ways the Game Boy could never approach, and a processor running more than 4 times faster. Sega followed in 1990 with the Game Gear, a handheld color television built into the same chassis as its games machine, complete with an add-on tuner that let a kid watch actual broadcast TV on a device meant to play Sonic the Hedgehog. On every single measurable spec sheet, in every category an electronics reviewer in 1989 would have cared about, the Game Boy lost. It lost on color, it lost on screen quality, it lost on processing power, it lost on graphical capability. By the metrics the industry used to judge these machines at the time, the Game Boy was not the best portable console released in that era. It may have been the worst. And yet it beat both of them so completely that within a few years, the Lynx and the Game Gear were both discontinued, while the Game Boy kept selling for another decade. This was not an accident, and it was not luck. It was not even really about games. Not directly. It was the result of one man's deliberate rejection of the entire premise that more powerful hardware makes a better product, and a bet that the rest of the industry was solving the wrong problem entirely. It is worth sitting with just how counterintuitive this outcome actually was at the time. Nothing in the consumer electronics industry of the late 1980s suggested that a company could win by shipping the weakest hardware in its category. The entire trajectory of the arcade and home console business up to that point had been a straight line of raw technical one-upmanship, each new generation of hardware boasting more colors, sharper resolution, and faster processors than the last, and reviewers and retailers alike were trained to evaluate new machines on exactly those terms. A journalist previewing the Lynx and the Game Boy side by side in 1989 would, by every convention of the era, have been professionally obligated to call the Lynx the superior machine, and many did exactly that. Several period reviews explicitly praised the Lynx's color display and hardware scaling effects while describing the Game Boy's screen in far less flattering terms. By the standards the press was applying, Nintendo had brought a knife to a gunfight, and initial coverage frequently reflected exactly that assumption. To understand how a demonstrably inferior machine annihilated its technically superior competition, you have to understand the philosophy of the engineer who built it and the very specific, very unglamorous problem he decided actually mattered. The Game Boy was designed by Gunpei Yokoi, a Nintendo engineer who had already spent 2 decades building the company's identity before he ever touched a handheld screen. Yokoi joined Nintendo in 1965, when the company still made playing cards, and he was the reason it survived the transition into toys and eventually electronics. He invented the Ultra Hand, a extending toy claw that became one of Nintendo's first hit products outside of cards. He created the Game & Watch line, tiny single-game LCD devices that were the direct ancestor of the Game Boy and which proved there was a real consumer market for portable electronic play. He also mentored a young Nintendo employee named Shigeru Miyazaki, who Yokoi personally shepherded toward what would become the Donkey Kong project. Yokoi's fingerprints are on nearly everything that made Nintendo Nintendo before the Game Boy existed at all, but Yokoi's most consequential contribution was not a specific invention. It was a design philosophy he called, in Japanese, Kareta Gijutsu no Suihei Shiko, which translates roughly to lateral thinking with withered technology. The idea is deceptively simple, and it ran directly against the instincts of nearly every other engineer in consumer electronics at the time. Yokoi believed that instead of chasing the newest, most expensive, most cutting-edge components available, a designer should take mature, well-understood, thoroughly de-risked technology that had already been in mass production long enough to be cheap and reliable, and find new, creative, lateral uses for it. This was not a philosophy born from nostalgia or technophobia. It was born from economics and from a clear-eyed read on what actually made a product succeed with ordinary consumers rather than hobbyists and reviewers. Cutting-edge components in the late 1980s were expensive to manufacture, difficult to produce at scale without defects, and voracious consumers of battery power. A screen with more shades of grey, more resolution, or full color required more transistors switching more often, which meant more current draw, which meant a shorter runtime on the same battery. Every engineering choice that made a device look better on a spec sheet also made it worse at the thing a portable device fundamentally needs to do, which is survive being carried around and used away from a wall outlet. Yokoi's team, working with hardware primarily engineered by Sharp, made a series of decisions that look almost stubborn in hindsight. They chose an off-the-shelf, already obsolete by industry standards processor core, a variant related to the aging Intel 8080 lineage, because it was cheap, well-documented, and power-efficient. They chose a passive matrix monochrome LCD instead of an active color display, because monochrome LCDs of that era drew a fraction of the power and cost a fraction of the price to manufacture at volume. They chose not to include a backlight at all, accepting that the device would be unusable in the dark, because a backlight was, at the time, one of the single largest power draws in any portable electronic display. This same withered technology logic shows up even in the Game Boy's physical casing, which is easy to overlook entirely because it looks like an ordinary detail rather than an engineering decision. The plastic shell was intentionally overbuilt relative to what was strictly necessary to protect the components inside, using a thicker, denser housing than competitors, along with a recessed screen and sturdy directional pad mounted on a simple, low-part count circuit board with fewer points of mechanical failure than the more complex, feature-dense designs found in the Lynx and Game Gear. None of this made the console more impressive to look at. It made it survive. The now famous stories of Game Boys, pulled intact from bombed-out buildings, run over by cars, and dropped from moving vehicles, were not marketing myths manufactured after the fact. They were the direct, foreseeable outcome of a design process that treated durability as a primary specification rather than an afterthought, in exactly the same way it treated battery life as a primary specification rather than an afterthought. Every one of these choices was, individually, a step backward in raw capability. Collectively, they were the entire strategy. Yokoi was not trying to build the best handheld game console that 1989 technology could produce. He was trying to build the cheapest, longest-lasting, most durable device that could still play a genuinely fun game, because he understood something about the actual buyer of this product that the spec-chasing engineers at Atari and Sega had not fully internalized. The buyer was very often not the kid holding the device. It was a parent standing in a store, choosing what to put under a Christmas tree or hand over for a long car trip, with a budget and a very practical set of concerns that had nothing to do with sprite scaling hardware. There is also a manufacturing dimension to this bet that rarely makes it into the popular telling. Every one of Yokoi's withered technology choices was not just cheaper to buy as a component, it was also dramatically cheaper and more reliable to manufacture at the scale Nintendo was planning. Mature production lines for monochrome LCDs and older processor cores had years of accumulated yield improvements behind them, meaning a far smaller percentage of manufactured units came off the line with defects, compared to the newer, more exotic color display technology and custom scaling chips Atari had to source for the Lynx. A higher defect rate on a more expensive-to-source display technology compounds directly into higher unit costs, and Atari's own internal struggles with Lynx profitability were inseparable from exactly this problem. Nintendo was not simply choosing to sell a cheaper device. It was choosing components that let it manufacture at a scale and consistency its rivals structurally could not match, which is part of why the Game Boy could be priced nearly 50% below the Lynx and still turn a healthy profit on every unit sold. If you were a parent standing in a Toys R Us in the winter of 1989 or 1990, trying to decide which handheld game system to buy your child, the specifications that actually drove your decision were not the ones being printed in gaming magazines. They were the ones printed on the price tag and buried in the fine print about batteries. The Game Boy launched in North America in July of 1989 at a retail price of $89.99. The Atari Lynx, which launched 2 months later, cost nearly double that, at $179.99. The Sega Game Gear, arriving the following year, split the difference at around $150. For a single purchase, that gap alone was significant. But the real divergence, the one that determined whether a family would ever buy a second one or recommend one to another family, showed up after the box was opened. The Game Boy ran on 4 standard AA batteries and delivered approximately 15 hours of continuous play on a single set. The Atari Lynx, powered by its faster processor and full-color backlit screen, required 6 AA batteries and delivered roughly 4 to 5 hours before it needed new ones. The Sega Game Gear was worse still, also requiring 6 AA batteries for a runtime frequently cited at around 3 to 5 hours, with some testing showing figures as low as under 4 hours depending on screen brightness settings, since the backlit color display was constantly drawing significant current. Do the arithmetic the way a parent standing at a cash register in 1990 might have, even informally, without ever writing it down. A family buying a Game Boy for a long car trip needed 1 set of 4 batteries to cover an entire day of intermittent play. A family buying a Lynx or a Game Gear for the same trip needed to either bring several backup sets of 6 batteries each, nearly double the individual battery count, replaced roughly 3 to 4 times as often, or accept that the expensive new toy would go dark somewhere around Ohio. This was not a minor inconvenience buried in a spec sheet. It was a recurring cost that compounded every single time the device was used, and it fell directly and repeatedly on the household budget, not as one purchase decision, but as a standing tax for as long as the device was owned. Industry estimates from the period suggested that the ongoing cost of batteries for a Lynx or Game Gear could, over a year of regular use, approach or exceed the original price difference between the machines. The parent was not just choosing a cheaper toy at checkout, they were unknowingly choosing a dramatically cheaper toy to actually own. There is a reason the Game Boy's marketing in this period leaned so heavily on durability and battery life rather than graphical fidelity, running ads that showed the device surviving being run over, dropped, and generally abused, alongside messaging about how long it lasted on a single set of batteries. Nintendo's marketing team was not spinning a weakness into a strength after the fact. They were selling exactly the thing Yokoi had actually engineered for, because they understood that this, not screen color, was the attribute that drove repeat satisfaction and word-of-mouth recommendation among the people actually writing the checks. Retailers noticed the same pattern from the other direction, through returns and complaints rather than surveys. Reports from electronics retailers of the era describe a meaningfully higher rate of customer complaints and returns associated with the Lynx and Game Gear, frequently tied to battery drain, battery cost, and devices that felt underpowered in the field, despite testing well in a well-lit showroom with fresh batteries already installed. A showroom demo unit sitting under bright fluorescent lighting with brand new batteries makes every one of these systems look impressive. A device in a child's backpack, 3 hours into a road trip, on its second set of batteries because the first set died an hour outside of town, tells a very different story, and that second story is the one that actually shaped repurchase and recommendation behavior. There is a second, quieter cost that rarely appears in any retrospective spec comparison, and it has nothing to do with the sticker price of batteries at all. It is the cost of a dead device at the exact moment a parent needed it most. A portable game system is, for a huge share of its actual buyers, not primarily an entertainment purchase. It is a peace and quiet purchase, bought specifically to occupy a child during a long drive, a flight, a waiting room, or a sibling's recital. A Lynx or Game Gear that died 3 hours into a 6-hour car trip did not just disappoint the child holding it, it handed the entire remaining car ride back to the parent, who had spent a premium specifically to avoid that outcome. That failure mode, a device going dark at the worst possible moment, generates a far more visceral, far more memorable kind of dissatisfaction than a slightly duller-looking screen ever could, and it is precisely the failure mode Yokoi's battery-first design was built to make as rare as possible. The commercial outcomes for Nintendo's technically superior competitors were not a slow fade, they were closer to a collapse, and the collapse followed the battery problem almost exactly, on a delay of a year or two, as word of mouth and repeat purchase behavior caught up with what showroom demos had never revealed. The Atari Lynx sold an estimated total of somewhere between 2 and 3 million units across its entire production run, a figure most commonly cited around 2 million, spread across a lifespan that stretched from its 1989 launch until Atari effectively discontinued support in the mid-1990s. Atari itself was already a company in serious financial distress by the time the Lynx launched, still carrying the reputational and financial scars of the North American video game market crash of 1983, and the Lynx's high manufacturing cost, driven directly by its more advanced but more expensive to produce hardware, meant Atari was reportedly losing money on many units even at its higher retail price. A device engineered for maximum capability turned out to be extremely difficult to manufacture profitably at any price point that ordinary consumers would actually pay. The Sega Game Gear performed somewhat better, moving an estimated 10 to 11 million units over its production life, a genuinely respectable number in isolation, but set against the Game Boy's eventual total of well over 118 million units, the comparison is not close. Sega discontinued the Game Gear in most markets by 1997, roughly 6 years before the original Game Boy line, having gone through several hardware revisions, including versions specifically aimed at reducing its notorious battery drain, essentially chasing after the exact problem Yokoi had designed around from day one. Both companies, in their own internal postmortems, and in later interviews with the engineers and executives involved, converged on strikingly similar explanations for what happened, and the explanations were rarely about the games themselves. Sega's own hardware designers later acknowledged that the Game Gear's battery consumption was a persistent, unsolved liability throughout its entire life, one that no amount of revised hardware ever fully fixed, because the fundamental architecture, a full-color backlit LCD, was inherently power-hungry in a way no clever engineering could fully escape without changing the display technology itself. Atari's financial struggles with the Lynx were compounded by manufacturing costs that made profitability difficult even before battery complaints entered the picture, meaning the company was simultaneously losing money on hardware sales and losing customer goodwill on battery life, a genuinely difficult position to recover from. Meanwhile, the Game Boy's library grew around games specifically designed to be played in short, interruptible bursts, on a screen with no color and heavy motion blur, using simple, blocky sprite designs that happened to read clearly even on that limited display. Tetris, bundled with the system in most Western markets starting in 1989, is frequently credited as the single most important software decision in the platform's history, precisely because it was a game whose appeal had nothing to do with graphical horsepower and everything to do with being endlessly replayable in exactly the short, portable, anywhere sessions the hardware's battery life was built to support. The software and the hardware philosophy were not separate decisions. They reinforced each other, deliberately. By the time Nintendo released the Game Boy Pocket in 1996 and the Game Boy Color in 1998, both competitors were already gone or fading from the market, and Nintendo had spent nearly a decade banking not just sales revenue, but something harder to buy outright, which was trust. A generation of parents who had bought a Game Boy once watched it survive years of abuse and thousands of hours of use on a handful of batteries, and had no reason to look anywhere else the next time a portable device purchase came up. That accumulated trust turned into something close to a structural moat once Nintendo's software library matured, because it meant later genuinely capable competitors faced a problem that had nothing to do with their own hardware quality at all. When more advanced handhelds did eventually arrive with backlit or full-color screens and dramatically improved battery efficiency through newer display technology, they were not just competing against Sega and Atari's old mistakes. They were competing against an entire installed base of families who already owned a device they trusted, an enormous back catalogue of games built specifically around that device's constraints, and a purchasing generation who had internalized, correctly, that the Nintendo name on a portable device meant a purchase that would not disappoint them in the exact moment it mattered most. Hardware specifications turned out to be a battle Nintendo could eventually catch up on at its own pace, on its own schedule, once the underlying display technology matured and became cheap enough to fit inside the same withered technology cost discipline. Trust, once lost in the first 18 months of a category's existence, was a battle Atari and Sega never got the chance to fight again. Act 5. The Principle. The Game Boy's victory was not a story about a company that built the best technology. It was a story about a company that correctly identified which constraints actually mattered to the person making the purchase, and then optimized ruthlessly for those constraints while accepting real, visible weakness everywhere else. Nintendo did not win despite having worse specs. In a meaningful sense, having worse specs, deliberately chosen, was the mechanism of the win, because those specific weaknesses were the direct byproduct of the exact trade-offs that produced the batteries lasting 15 hours instead of 4. This is a pattern that shows up again and again outside of handheld gaming, in categories that look, on the surface, nothing alike. It is the same underlying logic behind a car company that wins market share not with the fastest engine, but with the one that starts reliably every winter morning for a decade without complaint. It is the same logic behind a phone that succeeds not because it has the sharpest camera on paper, but because its battery survives an entire day of actual use without the owner hunting for an outlet. In every one of these cases, the products that win the spec sheet comparisons in a showroom and the products that win the long-term loyalty of ordinary buyers are frequently not the same products, because the showroom rewards a completely different set of attributes than daily life does. It is worth being precise about what this principle is not saying, because it is easy to flatten into a much emptier claim. This is not an argument that simplicity or cheapness is inherently virtuous, or that companies should always undershoot on capability. Plenty of products have failed by being underpowered in ways that genuinely mattered to their buyers, shipping a device that was cheap and durable, but simply could not do the one thing customers actually needed it to do. The Game Boy's genius was not that it was weak. It was that Yokoi correctly diagnosed which specific weaknesses his particular customer, in that particular context, would never actually notice or care about, and which strengths that same customer would notice immediately and repeatedly every single time the device was used. A washed-out 4-shade screen with no backlight turned out to be a weakness the target buyer barely registered, because the games were designed around it, and because a child playing Tetris in the back seat was not comparing it side by side against a Lynx in a store. A dead battery in the middle of a road trip, on the other hand, was a weakness that same buyer registered instantly, every time, with no possibility of being designed around after the fact. The discipline was not in choosing weakness generally. It was in choosing correctly, with real specificity, which weaknesses were survivable and which were fatal. Gunpei Yokoi's own career after the Game Boy is its own small, sobering coda to this story. He would go on to lead the design of the Virtual Boy in 1995, a genuinely ambitious piece of hardware that, in something close to an inversion of the Game Boy's philosophy, prioritized a novel and technically impressive stereoscopic 3D display, and it was a commercial failure, plagued by user discomfort and a red-only monochrome image that reviewers and consumers alike found difficult to embrace. Yokoi left Nintendo not long afterward. It is a reminder that lateral thinking with withered technology was not a magic formula that guaranteed success in every application. It was a specific, disciplined answer to a specific, correctly identified problem: durability and cost and battery life for a portable device aimed at a mass consumer market, and its power came from how precisely it was matched to that problem, not from some general principle that simpler is always better. There is one more piece of the story worth sitting with, because it complicates the tidy version of this narrative just enough to be honest about it. Nintendo did not win purely on hardware philosophy alone, stripped of everything else. The Game Boy also had Tetris, a genuinely exceptional piece of software that could plausibly have carried a mediocre piece of hardware a long way on its own merits. And it is fair to ask how much of the outcome was Yokoi's engineering discipline versus simply being the platform lucky enough to land the single most addictive puzzle game of the era as its pack-in title. The honest answer is that the two cannot be fully separated, and that is itself part of the lesson rather than an asterisk on it. Tetris was chosen as the pack-in specifically because Nintendo's negotiators, including a young Minoru Arakawa and Nintendo of America's Howard Lincoln recognized that its appeal was universal and format-agnostic in a way flashier, more graphically demanding titles were not. A game that lived or died on color, resolution, or processing power would have been a poor match for the withered technology hardware underneath it. A game built entirely on falling blocks and pattern recognition was a perfect match. The software decision and the hardware philosophy were the same bet, made twice, in two different departments of the same company, and they reinforced each other, precisely because both were built around the same underlying need of what the mass consumer actually wanted from a portable device. The lesson embedded in the Game Boy's decade of dominance over objectively superior hardware is not that underpowered technology beats powerful technology. It is that winning a market rarely comes from winning the comparison sheet a reviewer builds in a well-lit room with fresh batteries and no clock running. It comes from correctly identifying the comparison that actually happens later, in the back seat of a car, 3 hours into a trip, when one of these devices is still turned on and the other two have already gone dark.